Welcome to the first of our British history videos. In this brief video, I will be introducing the earliest of our historical eras, the classical and the medieval era. We're going to start from 54 AD, and we're going to go right up to 1348 AD, covering a substantial amount of time and major events within this time. This period of time is known for its ever-changing leaders and ever-changing national identity. So from very early in history, the British Isles have been settled and resettled as different peoples from different places in Europe made their home there. In the classical and medieval period, we will look at some of the peoples that arrived, their motivations, and how they changed the culture. So we can see here, we'll be examining four main aspects of this time. But before we look in detail, I want you to imagine this period as one of invasion and conquest. We'll start in order of the timeline of events. The first being the invasion and the conquest by the Romans. The second will be the invasion and conquest by the Anglo Saxons. The third will be the invasion and conquest by the Normans. And finally, perhaps the deadliest invader of all, the Black Death, not a human invader, but a disease. So each invasion left an impact, and each invasion differed slightly from the others. So the Romans arrived in the British Isles in 54 AD. The Anglo Saxons arrived in 410 AD. The Normans arrived in 1066 AD. And the Black Death arrived in 1348 AD. So before we examine who these four invaders were, let me give you some background on the British Isles prior to the Roman arrival. So before the Roman arrival, actually very little was known at the time about the British Isles. It was a fairly mysterious place with many aggressive, hostile tribes that would attack any invader. But more importantly, they would also attack themselves. The tribes were known as the Britons, and they're indeed ferocious. They were aggressive. They were not united in any way. Each tribe kept to itself and fought each other. Each tribe had its own identity, its own culture. So they weren't united in any way. Okay. Who were the Romans? So the Romans were originally from Southern Europe in what is now known as Italy, but really they ruled a vast amount of land, including most of Western and Southern Europe. They're actually one of the largest empires to ever exist. They were unique at that time for their style of government and their military tactics. They managed to both successfully manage their huge empire and their army. They were first and foremost conquerors. They took land by force and they ruled its people by aggression and violence. Their army was famous for its tactics and its discipline. What made the Romans unique amongst other civilizations of the time was the ability to integrate and allow many nationalities, many cultures and religions to live together in relative peace. There were, of course, strict sets of laws, but generally, citizens were allowed a certain amount of freedom in their daily lives without fear of violence. The Roman Empire was built around land and around taxes. So an empire this size needs to be constantly tested in battle, and it needs a lot of money in taxes to be paid to the empire. Conquering new lands meant they would get all of these things. Who were the Anglo Saxons? So the Anglo Saxons were originally people from Northern Europe, so Scandinavia and what is now Germany. And the Anglo Saxons traveled and settled in many places around Europe. They really can be considered some of the earliest Viking settlers. They've, having originally been sea raiders before settling down to own land or join in groups. So unlike the Romans, the Anglo Saxons were tribal and were not usually welcoming of different people. They were greatly feared in battle, as they were tall and they used long swords and shields. Actually, the Anglo Saxons would have visited the British Isles with the Romans in charge, actually in small numbers. They would become a type of warrior farmer. So they would claim land and they would defend it aggressively once they were there. Who were the Normans? The Normans were also of previous Viking heritage. Very much like the Anglo Saxons, they were a type of warrior farmer who claimed lands and they settled there. The Normans lived in an area of northern France called Normandy. Unlike the Anglo Saxons, they were actually given this land by the French ruler after they made an attack on Paris, and the French king gave them some land for peace. And they actually settled in the Normandy area for quite a long time. They spoke a type of French, and they developed a unique style of architecture, and especially church building architecture. They were aggressive, they were warlike, and they also tried to take many places in Europe by force. What was the Black Death? So finally, the last invader to introduce is the disease, the Black Death. Of course, this is not a human invader, but it was a disease that was carried by the fleas that lived in the fur of black rats. The official name for this disease was the bubonic plague, but because it was so deadly, it was known locally as the Black Death. The British Isles was not alone in suffering from this disease. It was, in fact, a global pandemic, one of the earliest global pandemics. But it did have profound and long-lasting effects on the culture of Britain and the society itself. So before we look in detail at each of these four invaders, it's always a good thing to consider a wider view of historical events. So history is not just about dates and events, but analysis on the motivations and effects on a society or a culture. So good questions to consider informally are, why was Britain invaded so many times? Was the reason similar? And how did the influx of so many people affect the culture of the British Isles? Can we see evidence of this? And what was the legacy of each invader? What did each invasion leave behind or change permanently?